Wonderful. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Hello, Ray. This is exciting. We're here because of this baby. Can everyone see it? Ray's book. Ray and I will be talking about banning the bomb, smashing the patriarchy today. And I am so excited that you're here. We will do the following in a second. I'll introduce you. I'll say a little bit about the book. And then I thought we'd start by talking a little bit about activism and feminism and what that has to do with diplomacy and disarmament. Because I think in conventional wisdom, too often it's assumed that activism has nothing to do with diplomacy. It's actually quite the opposite. And who would even need feminism when it comes to disarmament? So we'll be talking about that. You will then also read from your book. Maybe, ideally, you prepared maybe 2 passages on something on feminism, disarmament, and then on the actual work to ban the bomb. Then we have question time. I will be asking a couple of questions that I prepared, and then we'll have time for the audience to ask some questions. So, you are Ray. For everyone who doesn't know yet, but I'm sure there are already many fan girls and boys in the room. So Ray Acheson is currently the director of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom's disarmament program, Reaching Critical Will in New York City, where you are currently based as well. Ray leads the organization's work on stigmatizing war and violence, advocating and organizing for disarmament, and raising feminist perspectives on militarism and weapons. Ray represents WILPF within the International Steering Group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, which won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. Ray, you've also been awarded the 2020 Nuclear Free Future Award and the 2018 UN Women Metro New York Champion of Change Prize. So, and this book, which I'm generally a big fan of, I meant to get through the whole book by this evening. I didn't manage quite as much, but almost, not much left. So about this book quickly, with so much at stake from climate change and reproductive rights, threats from weapons of mass destruction to police brutality, the last decade has seen ordinary people take to the streets to challenge and change the way our governments and institutions legislate our future. Movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too have had an incredible impact on public understandings and political commitments, showing the meaningful change that social movements and popular resistance can have on our world. The story in this book offers a look inside the anti-nuclear movement and its recent successful campaign to ban the bomb. From scrappy organizing to winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 and achieving a landmark UN treaty banning nuclear weapons, Ray narrates the journey of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons and development in feminist disarmament activism. Ray, it is such a pleasure to have you here, and as someone who's currently also trying to, well, I have 4 weeks left to write her own book. I'm just like hugely impressed by this, what you have achieved. It is incredibly well researched. The insights are impressive, and it is so inspiring, this book. I'm just impressed. There's not much else to say. I'd like to start this conversation this evening by you sharing how, first of all, how you got into this work. You've been doing work on disarmament and especially nuclear disarmament for quite some time. And then also your kind of the more general thoughts about what nuclear disarmament has to do with feminism, why you started linking the two. And I mean, before that, we've had decades of feminist movements doing exactly that. And also what activism has to do with diplomacy and why we need activism in diplomacy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kristina, for organizing this, and for the rest of the team too, Anna and Nina and others at the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, for offering to host this event, and I'm very pleased and relieved to hear that you like the book so far. And I saw your tabs, that's color tabs, those are always good and encouraging to see in one's book. So yeah, thanks so much. I'm coming to you today from unceded Lenape territory in what is known as New York City. And also want to give a shout out to everyone that is supporting Cancel Canada Day today. Given the history of genocide in Canada, there's been a big push to cancel the celebrations. I was raised on Anishinaabe land in what is known as Toronto and the surrounding area. And so I just wanted to give a shout out for that issue today because it is relevant also for our work on nuclear weapons, given the legacies and ongoing persistence of nuclear colonialism that affects primarily Indigenous people around the world. So in terms of my work on this issue, I mean, I've been with WILPF, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, for more than 16 years now as an international staff member. And I am very active in a lot of different campaigns for disarmament, working on not just nuclear weapons, but also the arms trade and autonomous weapons and drones and military spending and the cultures of militarism. And so I bring all of that to my work on nuclear disarmament. It's not a single issue for me. It's a much bigger issue about how we organize ourselves in societies globally, how international relations works, and how force and violence are seen as instrumental parts of that. And that's where the feminism really comes in, bringing alternative perspectives about how we could organize ourselves, how we could interact globally as well as within our societies. And the history of feminism, of course, has provided an analysis of the dominant framework for what it is to be safe and secure and how to achieve safety and security in our world. The dominant framework being very patriarchal, very reliant on a sense of force and violence being essential to security, of weapons and militarism as being the only credible ways to shore up security for the nation state. And so all of that framework is very important for understanding nuclear weapons, because if we don't have that analysis, that feminist analysis and critique of the dominant system, then we're likely to miss out on the structural issues like patriarchy and like racism that sustain nuclear weapons and other weapons and violence and conflict more generally than that. Feminism helps us see that nuclear weapons are the leading edge of the patriarchal militarist mindset, of this idea that might makes right and that the best way to be secure is basically to be able to commit massive genocidal violence. I mean, that's what the nuclear armed states are saying when they say that nuclear weapons are essential to their security. It's that they have the right, the capacity, and the willingness to wipe out entire cities in order to make themselves feel secure. And feminist understandings of power also help us to sort through these myths and to challenge this supposition that nuclear weapons are about security or that they're for deterrence and that they actually prevent war and that they're, you know, these noble tools of peace in the world, which is how they're often described. Because in reality, nuclear weapons, of course, do not keep us safe. They've only ever caused harm. But this harm is completely discounted by the policy establishment elite because it's not harm to them. They're not the ones that have experienced the harm from uranium mining or the fallout from nuclear weapon testing or the storage of radioactive waste and every other part of the nuclear fuel chain. So bringing in the voices and the perspectives of those who have been harmed is a really important feminist contribution. And here I mean, you know, an intersectional feminist contribution where we're paying attention to how harms and oppressions relate to people based on overlapping identities and experiences in the world. So not just gender, but also sexual orientation and race and class and everything else. And lastly, I think the other thing is that feminism really teaches us important things about contesting power. And this gets to the activism part of your question as well. Feminism requires us to be brave. And that we really need to think strategically about how we can stand up to and undercut power, but also that we need to have the courage to do that. And collective organizing really helps us develop the tactics, the strategies, but also find this courage in each other, working together as part of a broader community. And past and social justice activism, feminist and other forms of social justice activism teaches us that what we're told is set in stone is really not. What we're told is the natural order of things is not. The world is the way it is, not because it is, it just poof, it's magically that way. It has been created that way through the dominant thinking and actions and control of certain people throughout history and our societies having the power. And so making change and progress is really about shifting perceptions about what is possible and what is realistic in this world. And holding on to the notion that hope doesn't mean a guarantee of success and that possible doesn't even mean likely. But what it means is that we understand that what we have right now is not working for the majority of people in the world. And by working together, we can actually change it.
It's precisely because of statements that you've just made that definitely for us at CFFP, we consider you as by far one of the smartest thinkers who links disarmament to feminism. So thank you for that. I already have a couple of follow-up questions. I'll ask some of them before we hear you read from the book. So speaking of patriarchy and the current system, this apparent world order that is like national order, which is not, which is why feminists contest this system, as you just explained. What you're talking in your book also about the dynamics that are being used, such as gaslighting. Can you explain a little bit more, how those patriarchal tactics, how we see them in the nuclear sphere?
Absolutely. Well, I think that was going to be in part of my first reading, so you'll hear that again in a moment. But I mean, I can just cut it out of my reading and do it now, actually. But basically, when I refer to gaslighting, it's a term that's been used to describe psychological violence, and it's from a film, actually. That was about a husband basically convincing his wife that what was real was not real. And he undermines her sense of self and reality and stability in the world. And we can deploy that critique, that understanding of behavior to the nuclear armed states, to compare that to a lot of their engagement on this issue. And so it's really an attempt to undermine and discredit the other person's or other countries', if you will, perspective in order to maintain power and privilege and dominance in a discussion. And so when the majority of states and international organizations and organizers and activists and survivors, et cetera, are all saying nuclear weapons threaten us and they have to be eliminated. Well, the nuclear armed states say, actually, nuclear weapons in our hands keep us safe, and we have to maintain them indefinitely. And when it's pointed out that the nuclear armed states haven't complied with their disarmament commitments, they then say, no, of course we have. We're in complete compliance with our obligations and commitments. We've done everything that we can. And now it's up to the rest of the world, up to the countries that do not possess nuclear weapons, to create the conditions before we can do any more. And so it's creating this story and this narrative where the nuclear armed states are really our benevolent protectors. They have nuclear weapons to maintain order in the world and keep us all safe. And that if we want them to get rid of those weapons, well, we have to do the work to make sure that they feel safe and secure. I mean, this is classic gaslighting and victim blaming and putting it all on the person who is being harmed or the country that is being oppressed or what have you, to really do the work to change the circumstances, even when all the power in that traditional sense lies with the country that is weaponized with the ability to commit genocide against you. So yeah, that's one of the things that I do talk about in the book.
And kind of these arguments that we need nuclear weapons as long as they don't exist, right? You explain quite in detail, for example, how under Barack Obama, the increase in nuclear spending, the modernization, was the highest or one of the highest, and that whilst there was this moment when a speech that he gave in Prague, that there was this hope amongst campaigners and activists that there might be a turning point. But no, again, it got back to that argument of we're going to keep them as long as they don't exist anymore because everyone else disarmed. But then, of course, no one disarms, and it's again left to the activists, right?
It's an incredible catch-22. They say we support the elimination of nuclear weapons, but we're going to keep ours until they don't exist anymore. How does that work exactly? And in the meantime, until we get to that point where they don't exist anymore, we're going to invest billions of dollars into not just maintaining the ones we already have, but modernizing them. And in the UK case, very recently announcing a 44% increase to its stockpile in blatant violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty even. I mean, forget about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It's a violation of the NPT. And they're just, nothing to see here. These are not the droids you're looking for. It's just incredible, incredible Orwellian or Kafkaesque approach to reality, right?
And the non-proliferation treaty that you mentioned is a treaty from the 70s that and interestingly enough, in your book, you also, you debunk all those lines of argumentation from nuclear weapon states, right? And government representatives. Another one is to blame activists for jeopardizing the progress that has already been made, right? That, when I spent a year at the Foreign Ministry here as an advisor, I had conversations with people in charge of the nuclear weapons and disarmament section of the Foreign Office. And it was precisely that argument, saying that those activists now, and that was before the nuclear ban treaty entered into force earlier this year. And her argument was, yeah, those activists pushing, like ICAN pushing for the nuclear ban treaty, it's like they're making all the progress that had been achieved with the non-proliferation treaty. They're jeopardizing this, right? So this is this victim blaming also that you mentioned before, that leaves no room for progress at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And we even heard during the process leading up to the negotiations on the ban, we heard that we were destabilizing the international world order to the extent where the US government even said at one point that they were more likely to use nuclear weapons in a world in which there was a ban treaty. So yeah, it's hard not to see these. If you're a feminist thinker or if you've ever worked on issues of domestic violence, it's impossible not to draw these comparisons in your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Just lost a thought. Okay, then another question. So you started your statements by referring to the colonial history, right, of the US and Canada. Can you please explain to us the racist and neocolonial underpinnings of the nuclear arms race and the history of nuclear weapons in general, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, nuclear weapons have been used once in the context of war, well, twice, on two Japanese cities in 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So there's already from the outset a racialized component to the development and use of nuclear weapons in the context of World War II. But beyond that, if we look at the uranium mining, which has mostly been done on indigenous lands in the US, Canada, Australia, if we look at where nuclear weapons have been tested, the Western Shoshone Nation in southwestern United States, in the area that's known as Nevada, are known as the most bombed nation on Earth because they've experienced almost 1,000 nuclear weapon tests on their territory. The British tested their nuclear weapons in the outback of Australia, claiming it was empty land, which of course it was not empty land, and indigenous communities been affected there. And the effects persist to this day. The US and France tested their weapons in the Pacific as well, and dispossessed many communities in the Pacific, and have housed radioactive waste storage there, like the US in the Marshall Islands, which is now leaking. They put it under a concrete dome. Just the French underestimated, which is didn't care about the radioactive fallout of their tests, as some recent studies have shown, that their sort of assessments of how much harm their tests created in what's called French Polynesia by the French was vastly undercounted the affected communities. Russia tested in Kazakhstan, you know, and you just everywhere that you look at the development of these weapons, it's all been racialized, impacting indigenous people, people of color, and also poor communities as well. And then again, when it comes to radioactive storage, it's the same situation as with the uranium mining and trying to deal with the waste of these weapons and the byproducts of these weapons. The production facilities also have poisoned land and people where they've been set up around the United States and around Russia and the former Soviet Union and in other places. So it's very consistent that it's a colonial and racist enterprise, and there's a lot of critique, excellent critique, scholarly and activist, against what is called nuclear imperialism or nuclear colonialism, that really outlines all of these challenges.
Thank you for explaining that. Would you mind reading from your book a little bit? Is that okay?
Sure. So I have two sections as you requested. I'll cut the first one short because we've already discussed a bit of it, but I'll start with the one on feminism, and then I'll move to one that's on banning the bomb.
Awesome.
So this part is from chapter 1. As much feminist scholarship explains, social constructions of gender ascribe contrasting characteristics to masculinity and femininity that are seen as mutually exclusive and entirely binary, and in which the masculine attribution is valued more highly than the feminine. Descriptors such as strong, rational, serious, and truthful tend to be associated with masculinity, while descriptors such as weak, irrational, emotional, and imaginary tend to be associated with femininity. One of the tactics used by representatives of nuclear armed states to undermine the credibility of diplomats seeking a ban on nuclear weapons was to assert that they didn't really understand international security and to accuse them of being emotional about nuclear weapons. When things like this were said in the conference room, I was reminded of a story that Carol Cohen relayed in an article in 1993. She explains that a white male physicist working on modeling nuclear counterforce attacks exclaimed to a group of other white male physicists about the cavalier way they were talking about civilian casualties. Only 30 million, he burst out. Only 30 million human beings killed instantly. The room went silent. He later confessed to Cohen, "Nobody said a word. They didn't even look at me. It was awful. I felt like a woman." This association of caring about the murder of 30 million people with being a woman is all about patriarchal gender norms. It's about seeing that position and seeing women as being weak, about caring about the wrong things, about letting your emotions get the better of you, focusing on human beings when you should be focused on strategy. In this perspective, caring about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons is feminine, weak, and not relevant to the job that real men have to do to protect their countries. Most of the nuclear armed states, in particular France, asserted this clearly and repeatedly in their opposition to banning nuclear weapons. Disarmament thus comes to be construed as a utopian vision of a world that cannot exist, because the argument goes, there will always be those who want to retain or develop the capacity to wield massive, unfathomable levels of violence over others. Therefore, the rational actors need to retain the weapons for protection against the irrational others. In this context, policy decisions are based on conceptions of power that are imbued with mistrust, threat, fear, and violence. Such policies do not allow for other types of international engagement or relationship between citizens and states. They dismiss alternatives as utopian and unrealistic. The denial of reason in someone else is an attempt to take away the ground on which the other stands, projecting illusions about what is real, about what makes sense, and what is rational. And I'll skip the rest because it's all about gaslighting. And then the second reading is from chapter 7, which is describing the working group that was set up, an open-ended working group that was set up in Geneva in 2016. The nuclear armed states had already boycotted most of the humanitarian impact conferences, and now they refused to show up to the open-ended working group. The idea that the rest of the international community would spend 5 years researching and discussing the reality of nuclear weapons, and that the nuclear armed states would just reject that evidence, was frustrating to more than one delegation. It showed that they were afraid of people power, said one diplomat. We were always confused and perplexed that the nuclear armed states stayed away from the humanitarian initiative and the open-ended working group. We kept reaching out to them, but they always rejected our efforts. Maybe they thought we wouldn't persist, but we did, and they left us with nowhere to build a bridge to. The nuclear armed states boycott really pissed off countries, said another observer. It actually gave momentum to the humanitarian impact conferences. It made it more legitimate for constructive dissent from the NPT, the Conference on Disarmament, and other forums. Countries wanted to change the game, and the boycott of the nuclear armed states opened space for them to do so. But the nuclear armed didn't learn from this. They didn't even learn from a similar experience in the process to ban cluster munitions. Contingency plays a major role in these circumstances, said one person who had participated actively in the process to prohibit cluster munitions. In that process, opponents made mistakes, he said. The way the United States played the cluster munition process was so arrogant. WikiLeaks cables show how unaware US diplomats were of the changing dynamics. And so the nuclear armed states continued to boycott and ridicule discussion about the humanitarian impacts. On top of this, there was their failure to implement the 2010 NPT action plan steps related to disarmament and their behavior at the 2015 NPT review conference. They had pride in delivering a dictionary instead of disarmament, and then they walked away from an agreed outcome at the last minute. And now, here in yet another meeting that the nuclear armed states were boycotting, the Australians, the Japanese, and the NATO states were doing all they could to prevent any further movement toward the negotiation of a nuclear ban treaty, working on the nuclear armed states' behalf. But the opponents to the ban finally went too far in Geneva, resulting in some of the most memorable moments from the entire ban process. Their opposition backfired spectacularly. Rather than halting or delaying progress, the belligerents propelled momentum for the ban to a point of no return. One of the greatest examples of this phenomenon is the moment that the Australian delegation tried to challenge the chair of the open-ended working group over his assertion the majority of participating states supported the establishment of negotiations of a legally binding treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. The Australians weren't having it. When the chair of the group released his draft report, which reflected this majority support for a ban, the Australian delegation said it did not agree the majority was in favor. So the Mexican ambassador pulled out a notepad with dramatic flourish and then asked the chair to conduct a poll on the spot. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations was the first to speak, clearly outlining its members' support for negotiations, 10 countries. The Latin American and Caribbean states spoke next, 33 countries. Then the African group chimed in, saving until the last sentence of their statement their declaration of support for a negotiating conference, 54 countries. This made up the majority. Fist pumps in the air were visible around the room, including from diplomats. A few European states like Austria, Ireland, Liechtenstein, and San Marino added their names to the tally, as did Fiji, Palau, and Samoa from the Pacific. But the results were already in. For the first time, we had on record all of these countries saying they supported the negotiation of a treaty banning nuclear weapons. We couldn't have pushed the envelope further from the supportive side, commented one diplomat. But the bully mentality exhibited by Australia and some of the NATO states to dare the smaller states into making their positions known worked wonders, she said. Sometimes this bullying shut things down, but not on the question of nuclear weapons. This is an issue of principle and security. Security for our people means no nuclear weapons, she said. We wanted to be on the right side of history.
This is amazing. And whilst we are in this moment of the campaign, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, and your involvement through the steering group, Ray, maybe also for some of the listeners who might not be as familiar with the whole process, can you give us a short overview of how it started, the campaign in 2006, right, in Australia? And like, I know the whole book pretty much is about that, so I give you 30 seconds maybe. And now and then you explain it in the book, like the different moments and when you re-strategized. And can you give us a short overview from Australia to the Nobel Peace Prize and then January this year? Yeah, that would be appreciated.
Okay. Yeah, so ICAN started in Australia, and at first it was really started by the Medical Association for the Prevention of War, which is an IPPNW affiliate in Australia. And it was about galvanizing medical students and the younger generation into the anti-nuclear movement. And a lot of the asks were the same as they have been for decades within the anti-nuclear movement, which was for the nuclear armed states to sit down together and negotiate a plan to eliminate their nuclear weapons. But as you know, in the aftermath of Obama's rhetoric and then the reality of what happened around 2010, when it was the sort of the restart between Russia and the US, and they negotiated the New START treaty and all of this stuff, but both countries invested massively into their arsenals, and so it was this sort of disconnect between the joyous, what seemed like or felt to many like momentum for nuclear disarmament, things were finally going to change, came to crushing realization that actually things were not going to change, and we're just reinvesting in the status quo and actually making things worse. And so it was around that time and coming out of that experience in 2010 that a number of folks within ICAN and some of the governments who had been very active in supporting the bans on landmines and cluster bombs, and so we're used to working with civil society and used to prohibiting weapons against the interests of the militarized states, came together to think about how we could do something similar on nuclear weapons. And so the strategizing and the campaigning for a prohibition treaty that would be negotiated with or without the nuclear armed states became then the clarion call for ICAN, and what we put our energies into. And the humanitarian reframing coming out of the 2010 debacle really helped us to propel that forward, because that was also how the bans on landmines and cluster bombs worked. So we learned a lot from those experiences of looking at the humanitarian impacts of weapons instead of allowing just a security discourse to persist, and using that to bring states and civil society and international agencies together in support of a prohibition that would help lead to the end of the use of these weapons and the elimination of these weapons. And so that was sort of the origin story of the ban and ICAN in, I hope, a quick amount of time. But yes, then so we were very active with governments to build up support for the ban for many, many years. It was a long process. Negotiations were short by comparison, just a few weeks in 2017 and in March and then June, July, and adoption of the treaty on July 7th, 2017, where 122 countries voted for its adoption. And ICAN won the Nobel Peace Prize that year for our work on the treaty and the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. And then after the treaty opened for signature and ratification, then our work turned to getting as many countries to join it as possible through their national legislation. And the treaty finally entered into force January of this year, January 22nd. And so we're still continuing to work on universalization of the treaty, but now we're also working to crack off some NATO states like Germany and others who are not yet supportive of the treaty, but where there is internal debate and dissension over the issue of nuclear weapons. There are German political leaders who want to see US nuclear weapons removed from Germany's soil. There are leaders within other NATO states that want to see a different security doctrine for NATO that doesn't involve nuclear weapons. We're also working at the local level in many countries that don't yet support nuclear weapons. So getting city legislatures and towns to say they support the treaty and want their country to join. We're working with parliamentarians in opposition parties and in government parties to raise this issue. We're working at the level of universities and schools to encourage disruption of the connections between the pipeline from, you know, engineering and chemistry programs in universities going into nuclear weapons development. And we're working for divestment from nuclear weapons, both personal divestment of your own money in your own bank, but also government pension funds and other international financial institutions to have them pull funds from nuclear weapon producing companies. So those are some of the things we're up to. We're obviously very active in multiple ways around the world, and hope that many of you watching this today will be inspired to get involved.
Well, I have so many questions, and already note to those who are listening, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A section here, and I will get to them later. So Ray, a couple of my questions. I'm gonna ask two right away. So first of all, what was that day in October 2017 like when the Nobel Peace Prize for ICAN was announced? Kind of this personal aspect, I'd be curious to hear. And then a question I guess you are confronted with all the time and you can't hear it anymore, but I find it very useful to have it asked here as well. So one argument you and everyone working on nuclear disarmament are constantly being confronted with is it is that opponents say, yeah, but the nuclear ban treaty, like, it doesn't make any sense because the nuclear weapon states, which are 9, it's the UN Security Council permanent members, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. So the nuclear ban treaty doesn't make sense because none of those countries and no NATO country have ratified it and will ever ratify it. So please, I know you've done it a million times, react to that. So what was it like to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and then the response to that old boring argument?
Yeah, well, it was the middle of the night for me when we won, like maybe 3 or 4 a.m. or something. So I woke up to my phone pinging off the hook. So that was quite exciting, but also surreal because I was not awake. And saw one of my friends in Australia on Democracy Now! At 7 a.m. So that was sort of how I woke up more readily to it. So yeah, that was exciting. It was also during the middle of UN General Assembly First Committee. So went to work the next day, went into the UN conference room, and it was a bit like a rock star atmosphere where everyone was very excited to see the ICAN people and lots of celebrating there. And it really, because it was such a community-based effort amongst activists and diplomats and some people at the UN and the ICRC and other agencies, it really did have this feeling like we'd all won together. And so the diplomats were just as excited of the recognition of the work. And many of them also came to Oslo for the ceremony in December of that year as well. So I think, you know, it was really a warm moment, but of course also then immediately very hectic because then you have to deal with all the media, and we did a press conference at the UN and traveling all over the place. And but it was great to see campaigners in all the active countries around the world on their, you know, local and national media talking about this. And there was really a great sense of this being a transnational and very collective and collaborative campaign. this isn't a single person campaign. This is something that people around the world are as invested in as anyone else. And so that was all, I think, really heartening to see then. And then it allowed us to have some of the credibility that I think a lot of people dismissed, even once we had the treaty adopted. And this comes to your second question. And it's funny that answering this, we've answered it the same way always, but since winning the Nobel Prize and before winning the Nobel Prize, our answers are treated differently, right? Suddenly we're more credible all of a sudden because we have this status symbol, which to me is ridiculous, but this is how society works, unfortunately, in its celebration of celebrity. But basically, the answer is that, first of all, we can't leave it to the most violent states in the world to set the norms for disarmament and demilitarization and nonviolence and to eliminate weapons. That has not worked. The treaties banning landmines and cluster bombs are clear evidence that the process that we've taken with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons works, because it's then the majority of the international community that understands the humanitarian and environmental impacts of these weapons, rejects them as tools of security, coming together to codify that in international law and to put up barriers to the production, acquisition, use and possession of these weapons. That's how we've done it with these other treaties. It has been effective over time and only grows in effectiveness over time. And so we anticipate the nuclear ban treaty going in this direction. And we can already see this with what I was just mentioning about divestment. We saw before we had the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, many financial institutions that we talked to said, yes, of course we have divestment against cluster bombs and landmines. Those are illegal. Nuclear weapons aren't illegal. So we made them illegal. Those same financial institutions are now divesting their money from nuclear weapons. So this is, the way that collective social consciousness works isn't dictated by the 9 nuclear armed states to the rest of us. They hold court in their sort of world of power and violence, but they can't control how the rest of us think. They're losing control of that narrative. And that's what the process of banning nuclear weapons has given us. And so, yes, while we're under no illusions that this treaty will magically eliminate nuclear weapons overnight, which is one of the things we've been repeatedly accused of imagining, we see it as an essential tool in the process of stigmatizing these weapons in the public consciousness, of mounting economic obstacles to their continued production, to disrupting the mainstream dominant narrative about nuclear weapons being for deterrence and security and blah, 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 and disrupting, the way that NATO countries speak about these weapons or consider these weapons, and helping to challenge the policies and the practices that sustain these weapons globally. And so it's all part of an iterative, ongoing process, not a magical one-off solution to the problem of nuclear weapons.
My next 2 questions would be one on Germany. You mentioned Germany before, and then also another one on the humanitarian initiative. You kept referencing it. So let me start with the humanitarian initiative. That is an initiative, you said it, that kind of focused, started to put the focus on the impact on people that nuclear weapons have, instead of and directing away the focus from this so-called security aspect. If we add further, so Ray, you're not only working on nuclear disarmament, but you are a disarmament expert more broadly. You've also done quite some work on cyber security. Do you think that this humanitarian focus and a humanitarian initiative would be needed and is essential to bring into kind of this newer conversations around cyber security, where we've seen over the past couple of years a more war and conflict and militaristic language as well. That would be the first question. And the second one, so Germans are going to the polls in end of September. Currently, many people expect that we might have a coalition between the Green Party and the Merkel and the Conservative Party after the election. The Green Party is very open to ratifying the treaty, they're supportive of the treaty, but I guess it's very unlikely that in coalition negotiations, a coalition would agree on ratifying the treaty. But we're still working on that, and we as CFFP are supporting ICAN with efforts in that regard. But even if that might be difficult with the Conservative Party, there are other ways, right, that Germany can support the treaty. You, I assume, have many good arguments that would counter conservative arguments, such as, yeah, but we're part of the NATO, and as such, we benefit from kind of the US nuclear deterrence policies. So as a NATO country, we would not be able to ratify the treaty at all. So what else could Germany do if that would really not be an option? And what would you like Germany to, what would you, for Germany, what would you like to see here? And the question on the humanitarian initiative when it comes to cyber.
So I'll start with that one. So I'm not the cyber expert. My colleague Alison Pitlack is doing most of our work on cyber, but I'm of course familiar with the issue and the arguments, and absolutely a humanitarian approach is essential there. A lot of what we've seen in the cyber domain in terms of state versus state attacks, but also, you know, state versus corporations, or state surveillance and other cyber oppressions of people within their states or within other states. All of this needs a humanitarian framing, no matter what angle that you're looking at it from. And so much of this takes place within, you know, there's so little transparency, there's so little discussion at the international level of what's actually going on. Most of what we know is what comes out in the news that we can hear about and that people are trying to piece together and understand. And I think having a better assessment of how to prevent this trajectory where we're heading against cyber attack and cyber militarization or cyber warfare, and even all the language that we use in the framing of this whole problem normalizes so much of this approach to the cyber realm. And so absolutely a humanitarian conversation in that space is essential, and one that pays attention also to an intersectional feminist perspective around gendered impacts, racialized impacts, et cetera. And the same is true for the conversations that we're having around increasing autonomy in weapon systems as well, and looking at the development of artificial intelligence and algorithmic targeting within weapon systems. It's really scary stuff. And it's so the conversations take place in this worldview in which, oh yeah, this is inevitable, and now we just need to tinker at the edges of it and like figure out what needs limiting, or, you know, what we should and shouldn't do, instead of just, no, let's not waste all of our time and our energy, our human and economic resources on developing these weapons, on ways to kill each other, on ways to disrupt our public health systems or our critical infrastructure, and instead focus on preventing all of that. So it's a diametrically opposed way of approaching the issue, and we definitely need more challenges in that regard. And then in Germany specifically, yeah, so the history of NATO is really, really interesting for when governments in NATO say, oh, we must have solidarity with NATO, we can't possibly join the treaty or denuclearize because we're a member of NATO, and that would be bad. Well, NATO states were by and large bullied into accepting a nuclear doctrine. The US and also to some extent the UK forced this an issue throughout NATO's history. There used to be many states within NATO that refused to allow it to be a nuclear alliance, and it's not until relatively recently that it became one. I mean, it was only described as a nuclear alliance since 2010. And before that, nuclear weapons were included in the doctrine, but not in the original treaty setting up NATO, and not in the first strategic doctrine. Nuclear weapons were introduced later at the behest of the United States, who cajoled and bullied other countries into accepting the doctrine, and also in Canada's case, accepting nuclear weapons on its soil. And Canada's since gotten rid of those weapons, and now Germany needs to do that as well. So there are, Germany can't use that as an excuse, should not use that as an excuse. It's an excuse that is like, it's an excuse that's an excuse, right? It's like, it's treated as gospel truth, but it's not actually a credible argument. And so challenging that, I think, is very important, and looking at the history of NATO development is very important. And so Skjolv Englund, who's a Norwegian scholar, has done some excellent work on this. I'd highly recommend that. ICAN just put out a new report on NATO also that explains how NATO members can join the treaty. So I'd recommend looking at that as well. Beyond ratifying the TPNW, regardless of whether it does that, Germany could work to get rid of the nuclear weapons on its soil. Germany could work within NATO to denuclearize the alliance, to get nuclear weapons out of the alliance. Germany could disassociate from the nuclear doctrine of the alliance. This is something that we're encouraging countries to do as an interim step, to say that we won't support the nuclear mission, we won't participate in the nuclear war planning group that all NATO states are members of, and we don't endorse the use of nuclear weapons on our behalf. The other thing that this does, besides Germany's policy or any NATO state's own policy on this, is it affects the United States excuse for nuclear weapons, because it often says, if we don't have nuclear weapons in Europe, then the European NATO members are just going to get nuclear weapons themselves. So if we actually have Germany and others saying, no, we're not going to get nuclear weapons and we don't want yours either, then that undercuts the US argument for maintaining nuclear weapons in NATO. So those are a few things. Divestment is also another thing. Some NATO members, like the Netherlands and Norway, have started divesting from their government pension funds from nuclear weapons, even though they haven't ratified the treaty. So there's a lot of things that can be done.
Brilliant, thank you. 2 questions from the audience. I know we only have like 2 minutes left, but there's just too much to talk about. First question about the recent Biden-Putin summit and the statement on nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. What do you make of that and the whole outcome of the summit with regards to nuclear disarmament? And the second question about what exactly your work was like on including gendered consequences and the humanitarian consequences into the treaty.
So yeah, on the Biden-Putin summit, I mean, great that they reaffirmed that. That was like the lowest thing they could have done.
Bar so low, right?
Back to, right, exactly. And it takes us, it's like, yay, we're back in the 80s. Like, it's, so they could have undertaken a number of steps. I mean, obviously, I would have liked them to say, all right, we're joining the TPNW and getting rid of our nuclear arsenals. But even before that, there was a number of concrete steps they could have committed to. Further reductions of their arsenals, committing not to invest billions into modernizing their arsenals, anything along those lines. So unfortunately, not too inspired by that, but, great that they agree nuclear war shouldn't be fought. And then on the gendered impacts, yeah, that was, it's groundbreaking in the treaty in its recognition of gendered impacts of nuclear weapons. A lot of this came from the work of Mary Olson and others that have done work on exposing the differential impacts that ionizing radiation can have on women and girls' bodies. So that was really important to see. The Irish government worked very hard to include that recognition in the treaty. They were one of the champions of gendered language. There's also in the treaty a call on states to diversify participation, in particular, including women in disarmament and arms control negotiations and processes. So that's good. It's still very binary for my tastes, but it does advance things in that regard. It's also the first treaty to recognize the disproportionate impacts of nuclear weapons on Indigenous communities. So it's groundbreaking in that way, and it has environmental and victim assistance positive obligations in the treaty as well. So it breaks a lot of new ground in ways beyond just the prohibitions of nuclear weapon related activities. And I feel that it's a really important case study in what happens when you don't have the nuclear armed states in the room to say, no, that's not credible or realistic. And when you're actually attuned to what human beings need and have experienced in this world. So it's a reality-based treaty more than what we usually have on nuclear weapons.
Well, thank you so much, Ray. That's a wrap. That's been an amazingly insightful hour. Thank you so much, not only for the gift that this book generally is, but also for sharing all your knowledge that is the culmination of so many years of work and reading and fighting and research with us this midday evening for us. We are very grateful for the work you are doing, Reaching Critical Role, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, ICAN. And yeah, thank you for doing this, and thank you for the book, and thank you for being with us.
Thanks so much for holding this event.
Of course, anytime. Thank you for everyone who listened in. We will upload the video on the website and share on social media. If my colleague Anna shared in the chat a link to our membership program, if you're interested in supporting us, that is highly appreciated. And yeah, I'm wishing everyone a lovely rest of the day or evening, and speak to you all very soon again. Bye-bye. Thank you, Ray. Bye-bye.